Pixel art is the video game art style. Whether your first exposure was walking up to that tree in Minecraft and punching it with your bare hands, or in Super Mario Bros. When you take your first jump to destroy your first block to gain just a single coin with 99 left for your 1-up. Everyone at one point in their life has played a pixel art game and enjoyed it. It's the first visual aspect in a video game that easily translates the message that this is a video game. Unless you're this guy and you really like Minecraft Steve. Most of us probably have a family member or parent who remembers being in an arcade in the 80s. This was most likely their first exposure to video games and probably even pixel art, but they didn't really think of it as pixel art. It was just a video game. And because at the time technology was already so limited, the moving pixels on the blurry screen built into the arcade cabinet was the only way video games like this could be displayed. And that brings me to the first reason why I think pixel art is timeless. It is simultaneously the most limited but unlimited art style in video games. Obviously, this statement may depend on the console that you grew up on. If it was something like the Atari, then your view of pixel art may look something like this. Let's be honest, they just look like paper cutouts pasted onto the screen. But if you had grown up with something like the Nintendo Entertainment System or the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, then your view of pixel art might look something like this, or this. That's a good one. Nintendo is now the prominent video game developer and console manufacturer during the late 80s. Between the NES and the SNES, Sega released the Genesis. With the NES being an 8-bit console and the SNES and Genesis both being a 16-bit console, they were both able to display richer and deeper colors over the Atari with its paper cutouts. It does go higher, but we'll touch on that a bit later. Now, I don't have first-hand experience with this era of the console wars, but it was a real thing for kids to fight over the fact that this console and this console had a higher and lower bit rate. The modern day equivalent of something like this is a PC gamer telling a console gamer that they're literal shit for liking consoles. Before I go any further, I just need to say that I am not at all an art snob. A lot of famous artists would use an art style called pointillism, where they would take multiple colors and fuse them together. With these pieces, they were very unassuming close up, but when you took a step back, they were a full work of art. This is the exact same concept used in pixel art. Due to hardware limitations that the NES had struggled with, it was only able to display a certain amount of colors at once, with some being used for the background and others being used for character sprites and other models on screen. This created the need for extra creativity, whereas with the 16-bit consoles like the SNES and Genesis, they were able to display a lot more colors at once, creating vibrant images and detailed models. The 8-bit graphical art style was a great pedestal to show what could be possible with pixel graphics. But with the 16-bit era, it was a huge leap that brought us some of the most memorable titles we still reflect on to this day. And a lot of these games were responsible for the inspiration a lot of indie developers have for their art styles in the current day. I mentioned at the beginning of this video how arcade games in the 80s were not thought of as pixel art games. They were just video games. That's because these games were designed for their intended hardware, a cathode ray tube, or in other words, a CRT TV. And by today's standards, a CRT TV is completely outdated, displays nothing but a blurry image next to the high-end HD 4K, 8K, DK, OLED. Okay, I lied. Give me the CRT back, because have you ever played a retro game on a new age TV? It sucks. Everything is blown out. Everything looks like shit. Don't do it. This is concrete evidence that when developers were creating games for these consoles, they weren't concerned about how these games looked from a technological standpoint. All they had were pixels, and as the player, you didn't care about pixel perfect graphics. Mario jumped, Sonic ran fast, and Ryu Hadoukened. At this point, the world only had one perspective of how a video game should look until the PlayStation 1 and Nintendo 64 came out with their respective 3D titles that literally changed the world forever. After 3D graphics became a standard with the next generation consoles, it was pretty normal to see a lot less games developed with a pixel art style as the primary medium. At this point, we were into the 32 and 64-bit era with the PS1 and N64. These games were able to display 3D models and millions of colors on screen with ease. With technological advances at the time, why would any video game developer want to keep developing video games in a now outdated art style? This comes down to perspective. Even though we're within the brand new generation of gaming and have a disc-based console, we now know the difference between what is old and what is new. All the more reason for the console wars to continue, and people to fight over what has motion graphics and what does not have motion graphics, even though it's all the same game in the end. Like I alluded to before, pixel art would become something much larger than what it started out as. And even though we were now within the new generation, it didn't completely die out. Thankfully, we still had amazing developers that were still keeping this art style alive, but probably didn't even know it, with games like Mega Man and Castlevania on the PS1. But while researching this video, I discovered that Nintendo didn't really have a lot of pixel art games on the N64 in North America. They probably didn't see the North American market as profitable as the Japanese market for something that looked outdated. From this point on, 3D gaming pretty much took over. While looking for games for this video, it was pretty hard to find a notable game from the late 90s or early 2000s that were still using a pixel art style that weren't on a handheld console or was Cave Story. I would say that 60% of my brain associates pixel art with a handheld game console like the Game Boy. Just like the NES, the SNES, and the Genesis, the Game Boy Advance or the Nintendo DS had no choice but to display very visible pixels on their screens. So by nature, a lot of their games are very pixel art oriented. I'm not going to go into too much detail on the pixel art of the Game Boy Advance or the Nintendo DS, because we all know what it looks like, especially if you're a Pokemon fan. There are a few other handheld type devices that also have pixel art, but were not developed by Nintendo or used cartridges. You may not know where I'm going with this, but if you did not guess Tamagotchis or Digivices, then you would probably be wrong. If you want to talk about limitations, these are literally it. They had a screen that was smaller than the Game Boy. Unlike the Game Boy that could display 4 shades of gray at once, the pixels on this screen displayed as either on or off. If you somehow don't know what a Tamagotchi or a Digivice is, they're what's known as a VPET or a virtual pet. Their lo-fi style of pixel art was good enough to display what they were trying to convey on screen, but fun enough to constantly be addicting. And even though VPETs aren't an influential part of pixel art, I still feel like they're a pretty fun part of pixel art's history. Again, outside of handheld video games, we didn't really have a lot of console representation of pixel art until 2010, when we were introduced to a game that would revitalize and reintroduce pixel art into the mainstream. And that game was Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the game, featuring Anamanaguchi with their legendary soundtrack, but most importantly for the context of this video, pixel art. Believe it or not, this game was developed by Ubisoft, who is highly regarded for developing highly detailed 3D games. This game was paired with the Scott Pilgrim vs. the World movie, and quickly became a phenomenon with how it was rejuvenating the love of pixel art, alongside a forgotten style of music known as chiptune. To keep this video short, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the game, holds a very special spot in video game history and created a brand new platform for what was to come. Indie game developers became inspired by the art style, and musicians realized that video game music wasn't just meant for video games. Going forward into the current day over just the last decade, we have been graced with so many indie titles that feature beautiful landscapes and amazing character sprites crafted with only pixel art that it's literally overwhelming. Games like Shovel Knight and Stardew Valley in the 2D space and Minecraft in the 3D space are all games that started out as indie titles but are now massive because of their art styles. At this point, pixel art has kind of transcended from being just an art style that is normally associated with video games. In a weird way, it's kind of become a lifestyle, in the sense that tons of people on the internet use pixel art profile icons in the same way people use an anime profile icon, but we don't talk about those people. I've never had an anime profile icon. There are even some artists who are not even involved with a game developer or in game development whose main medium of art is pixel art. And honestly, I think that's the coolest form of digital art.
No, 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 no.
A really fascinating real life example of this was when in 2017, this really underground, really cool website known as Reddit created this really cool experiment for April Fools called r/place. It was originally this experiment where every Reddit user could place a single colored pixel every 5 to 20 minutes on a blank canvas to create art. But because Reddit is community driven, everybody in each community had to collaboratively work together to create a piece of art that would reflect their community. 5 years later, the same experiment would be conducted, but even bigger than the last. And the amazing thing about this is that all of the art was comprised of pixel art, inherently making r/place a new step in the history of pixel art. In the end, a video game isn't just defined by an art style that looks a certain way, and they aren't made for one age demographic or a type of person. They're meant to be something that is fun. And when I look at pixel art, to me, it looks fun. And I always hear chiptune or beep boop sound effects playing in my head. It provides this level of charm that 3D games just really cannot compare with. And don't tell anybody this, but I've always wanted to live in a pixel art world where chiptune is always playing in the background and there's little sound effects for every single thing that I do, but don't tell anybody this. Anyways, this has been a video about why I think pixel art is timeless, and if you liked this video, then go watch my last one. It was about growing up with a Game Boy Advance. It took way too long to make, and it goes on for way too long, but it's still a lot of fun. Either way, I don't know how to end this, so just click off. I don't know, dude. I don't know. Just click off.